Next couple segments are going to be a little shorter. I'm just going to focus on a game wrecker conversation, right? Who are the game wreckers in this game to keep an eye on? And then each week I'll try to mix it up a little bit and talk about who those are. But here's where I'm at with my game wreckers conversation. I'm going to start with the Notre Dame offense versus the Texas A&M defense and talk about both sides. And then I'll go into the Notre Dame defense against the Texas A&M offense. And the first one, it starts with, like, this is an easy one. When you look at the Notre Dame offense, it's Riley Leonard. I mean, there's a reason you brought Riley Leonard in as your quarterback, and it's not just to manage the offense. It's to be a playmaker. If you brought Riley Leonard in to manage your offense, then I don't know what you're looking for, and so I factor in. Let me say something real quick. An A&M guy says, "Are we saying Indy is better because of the stats alone, or are we also accounting for strength of schedule?" It's stats. It's watching film. I don't care about strength of schedule, to be honest with you. And if you want to talk about strength of schedule, A&M played one ACC team last year and got dominated. So it comes into a lot of it. Like, you've been great in the chat so far, and I really appreciate that you're coming here to engage. But it's really about stats and film. This breakdown, we do a show every day. This breakdown that I just did is a statistical breakdown. It is looking at the stats. There are other parts that we do. Tomorrow we'll do more about keys and execution, things like that. Yesterday we talked into some bigger picture things. This was a statistical breakdown. It's part of the conversation. And when you talk about, like, somebody was in the chat talking about, Notre Dame does this against lower inferior teams, and you're telling me you don't have a clue about Notre Dame when you say things. Not you, Aggie kid. I'm talking about the person that I banned from the chat. So it's not just about stats, but that segment of the show was a statistical breakdown of the two teams. It's not all we do. There's a lot more that goes into it. And this segment is going to be more about the practical aspects of this matchup, which it comes down to the players. Who makes the plays? And for Notre Dame, you bring in Riley Leonard to be a playmaker. You did not have a quarterback last year that could be a playmaker. And here's why that matters. These are the exact games that you bring Riley Leonard in for, and that's why he's my number one game wrecker for Notre Dame. He has to be a game wrecker. Here's what I mean by that. You are playing an A&M team with a great defensive line. You are playing an A&M team that's got a great head coach and a great defensive mind as head coach. You are playing an A&M team that has length and athleticism and presents some problems for your offense. You are not going to go out in this game and dominate Texas A&M in the trenches. I just do not see that happening. That'd be the biggest shock of all shockers. You got to hopefully hold your own. But the reality is that's an area where you do not have the matchup advantage. Last year, when Notre Dame's O-line got beat, that was a problem for Notre Dame. And it's always a problem. But you bring a guy like Riley Leonard in to say, hey, listen, we need you, looking at it from the coaching standpoint, this is what you're asking him. We need you, sometimes when things break down, to put your Superman cape on, right? And you got to do this, right? You got to pull off the Clark Kent, clothes, and you got to be Superman and go make plays. That's just the reality of it. These are the games where you need him to do some of that. You need him to provide some of that impact for your team. And when you go on the road and you are playing a top 25 team, and I actually have argued in a lot in the past years that A&M winning each season is overrated. I'm perfectly fine with Texas A&M being the 20th ranked team in the country. There's no doubt. As I said, they do have talent. They do have a talented quarterback. They do have decent skill on the perimeter. They are very good on the defensive line in the front seven. They did bring in what I felt was the third best offensive coordinator hire of the entire offseason. I'm totally fine with them being there. They're a legit top 25 team. So if you are going to go on the road and beat a team that's very good defensively, and especially in the front seven, on the road, your quarterback needs to be a big-time playmaker. And for Riley Leonard, that starts with his ability with his legs, and it also starts with his ability to make plays with his arm. He's got to do both. He has to do both. If he can't do both, he's going to struggle. This offense is going to struggle to consistently move the ball. They're going to have to be better in these situations. He's going to have to be better in these situations than what they had last year from a playmaking standpoint. And so that's why he's my number one game wrecker. Real quick response about A&M being exceptional at home. A&M's home wins last year were over New Mexico, Louisiana Monroe, Auburn, South Carolina, Mississippi State, and Abilene Christian. None of those teams were any good. The only team that they played last year that was good was Alabama. And yes, it was a competitive game, but they still lost that game. And Texas A&M in 2022 at home beat Sam Houston State, beat Miami by 8, lost to Ole Miss, lost to Florida, beat UMass, and lost to App State. So how difficult you are at home depends on how good your team is, right? So, and yes, I do think it's going to be a tougher place to play this time than it was last year because you've got a better coach. That's the key. You've got a better coach there. And that's why Notre Dame's playmakers have to step up. And Riley Leonard's where it starts, but he can't be alone. They're going to need their backs to make plays. Here's another reality of a game like this. I'm watching the Florida State Georgia Tech game. Do you guys remember the play? I believe they were running left to right on the screen. They ran an outside zone to the left, and Jamal Haynes cuts it back. And when they showed the tight copy, and it's funny because I got the all 22, and I went and I was like, is it as bad on the all 22 as it was on TV? It was. There was almost nobody from Florida State. Like the hole was literally, this is the TV screen. Like there was like barely any like Florida State guys on the outside. I mean, it was a giant hole. I hope that Notre Dame can do that against A&M. It's probably not going to happen. Your holes are going to be about this big when they're there, and they're going to close up in a hurry. That means your running backs need to see it and hit it with good timing and hit it fast. You're going to have this is one of those games you're not going to be most likely 60 to 70% with efficient runs. It's going to be 2s and 1s and 3s and some -1s. But when the 50 comes, you got to hit the 50. That's going to be the key. So you're going to need Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price to make some plays in this game. And here's the other thing too. You've got to be – there's a statement that Mike Elko made when he was the defensive coordinator at Notre Dame. And the defensive line for Notre Dame was struggling in fall camp, and they struggled in the spring. And there was a lot of angst from Notre Dame fans, shocker, about the offensive line. Or the defensive line, hey, man, you're going to struggle. And he was like, no, we're going to be fine. He said that offensive line, they're human lie detectors is what he called them. And when you're wrong, they're going to make you pay for it. Well, in this instance, it's one of those things where that's kind of how this A&M D line is. If you make a mistake, they're going to make you pay for it. What Notre Dame has to do on the flip side is they're not going to make a lot of mistakes on defense, in theory, but they're going to make some because everybody does. If there's a wrong fit by a linebacker, if there's a wrong fit by a safety, if a lineman is supposed to secure the C gap and he slants inside and you seal him, when those things happen, you've got to see it and you've got to hit it. And I think the other part of this too is the running backs out of the backfield could be big. And whether that's wheel routes, angle routes, seam routes, screens, however the case may be, your two most dynamic weapons, in my opinion, on offense are your two backs, Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price. You have to be able to hit that, have those guys hit those plays. You've got to be able to hit those big plays with those two guys. And then the other one for me, when I look at the game records on offense, it's going to come down to the two transfer receivers. I think Mitchell Evans is going to play well. I think Jaden Greathouse is going to have his success. But you're going to have to make some plays on the outside. You've got to make plays on the outside, and you've got to make plays on the outside vertically. The best thing that Notre Dame can do is to line up and say, yes, you're going to be good here, but you have to defend us to the width of the field. Look, Mitchell Evans was great last year. Slot players at times were pretty good last year. But the inability to beat teams on the outside allowed teams to change how they defended Notre Dame. They were able to reduce everything and knowing that they couldn't hurt them outside. Notre Dame is going to have to make an early statement in this game in the season by saying you have to hit some plays outside. Chris Mitchell, Bo Collins are those two guys that have to hit those plays. They're going to need those two fellows to step up and say, hey, listen, time is here. We've got it. The one-on-one is there. I've got to win off the line. I've got to win at the catch point and hit a couple of those big plays. I think that's going to be a big part of this game. And that can be game wreckers. That can be a thing where you're backed up. It's 3rd and 9. You're at your own 25, and you hit that one-on-one down the field, and boom, it sparks you. Did any of you guys watch the SMU-Nevada game on Saturday night? SMU could do nothing. I mean, they were just getting dominated, and then they hit 2 big plays. I think they were both to their tight end. 2 big plays completely changed that game around. They hit 2 shots down the field, and when they hit those 2 shots, it got them. It completely flipped the field. They couldn't move the ball. They couldn't get anything going. Nevada was kicking their butts, but they hit those big shots. It gave them. It flips the field. They get a much needed score. They got some momentum, and now all of a sudden, you're rolling. Notre Dame's going to need plays like that if they're going to win. If they're going to win this game and play the way offensively they need to play, and it really is going to come down to Chris Mitchell and Bo Collins are going to be the keys to there. Now, there's an opposite argument to this. The other part of this is A&M's got some game wreckers as well. And what Notre Dame has to do is make sure that the A&M game wreckers don't dominate this game. They're game record talents, but you got to make sure that they don't actually do that they don't actually make that type of impact in this game. And there's 3 guys that I really look at as potentially being that type of player. And the first 2 are up front. And Nick Scourton and Shamar Turner are 2 of the best linemen that Notre Dame's going to play all year. They're both good athletes for their size. Shamar Turner's a very athletic player. He's probably going to play on the edge at times, but my expectation is going to play more inside in this game over your guards. Nick Scourton's an edge player. They both had double-digit tackles for loss last year. The combined, I think they had 16.5 sacks between the 2 of them last year. They're guys who can take over a game. And if you get completely dominated up front, that can negate a lot of what's going on the perimeter. If we're to assume that Notre Dame has a skill player advantage, and for the sake of this conversation, let's have that. Let's assume that. Let's assume that Notre Dame has the advantage at tight end against their backers and safeties, and let's assume that Notre Dame has an advantage on the outside with Chris Mitchell and Bo Collins and Jordan Faison and Jaden Gray-Austin. Let's just assume that type of matchup can get completely negated if you get dominated in the trenches. And the game that's always going to pop in my head, and I'm old, and so I'm going to go old school, but I remember watching the 1995, I think it was the Orange Fiesta Bowl between Florida and Georgia. Is that the end of the 1995 season? It was between Florida and Nebraska. And that Florida team, I mean, they had Danny Warfel quarterback. You had Chris Doring at wide receiver, but you had a lot of other talented players. I believe Ike Hilliard was on that team. I believe that Rydell Anthony was on that team. I'm actually pulling up their stats now. You had Chris Doring was a 1,000-yard receiver. Ike Hilliard was on that team. Rydell Anthony was on that team. Jaquez Green was on that team. I mean, they had such great skill players, but they got annihilated by Nebraska. Why? Because Danny Warfel, I think they had like an early score. After that, could do nothing because he spent the whole game on his back. And it completely negated your perimeter advantage in that game. Completely negated it. Notre Dame has to make sure that they don't do that, and the 2 guys that can do that to them are these 2 players. And, JG Whitetown ND fan says, B, are they really that good? Who did they play against that was really good? Well, number one, I mean, Shamar Turner played in the SEC last year. I mean, he's not a guy that transferred in from Texas A&I. He's not a guy that transferred in from Sam Houston State. He's a guy that was there. He is that kind of player, and they had a lot of other guys that made a lot of production last year. So I'm gonna push back on that one. Number one, he had, he's a guy that last year, again, 10.5 sacks in a season, didn't play in the bowl game. That's pretty good production for a kid in the SEC. There's no doubt about that. And then Miami game that they lost, he did have a sack in that game. He had a sack against Auburn, 2.5 sacks against Arkansas. He had a sack at Tennessee, 1.5 sacks against South Carolina, a sack against Mississippi State. So he didn't exactly have production in bum moments against bad teams. He's a guy that has legitimate talent. Nick Scourton's a guy that if you go back and watch his film against teams like Ohio State and Michigan last year at Purdue, he more than held his own in those moments as well. So this isn't a guy, Nick Scourton, who padded his stats against terrible teams. He had 3.5 sacks against Virginia Tech, 3.5 tackles for loss against Virginia Tech. He had 3 tackles for loss at Nebraska. He had 2 tackles for loss at Michigan. And if you go back and watch that game, they were not garbage minute tackles for loss. They were in real situations. He had a sack against Ohio State, 2 sacks against Michigan, a half a sack against Iowa, had a sack against Syracuse, sack against Virginia Tech. He never had a single game with more than 2 sacks. And the reason I bring that up is because sometimes you'll have guys that get a lot of sacks, then they do it all in one game. If you guys remember when Jerry Tillery back in 2018 for Notre Dame had 8 sacks, led their team with 8 sacks that year. Well, I believe half of his sacks came in one game against Stanford. He had 4 against Stanford. He went the next 6 weeks without recording a single sack. When you look at Nick Scourton's production, it's week after week after week after week after week he's producing in the Big Ten. So I think both of those guys play against good competition and are good football players. You've got to make sure that they don't dominate the game. Nick Scourton's going to have a tackle for loss or 2. He's probably going to have a sack. You've got to make sure that they're not bad sacks. If you're at your own 42-yard line and it's 3rd and 9 and you've got to try to, and he gets a sack, fine. You take the sack, you punt the ball, you let your defense work. What it can't be is that sack when you're backed up and you've got to punt from your own 2, and now they're flipping the field, they're getting the ball at midfield. It can't be a sack that results in a turnover where they get a short field. It can't be a sack that knocks you out of field goal range or gets you out of scoring range. You've got to avoid the bad sacks. Sacks are going to happen in this game. You got to avoid the bad ones, and that's going to be the key for Notre Dame. Is in this game is don't let them take the game over. That's the key. Don't let them have the drive killers, and that's what going to be. The other one for me is Tyreek Chappell. He's a very interesting player because he's not your typical Mike Elko fit. And one of the things that I look at this matchup is I don't know where he's going to play. They list him as a starter at one of the corner spots, but then they also list him as a starter at nickel. Does he play outside? Does he play nickel? If he plays in the nickel, that creates some matchup problems for Notre Dame. Because I believe I actually like him in the slot. I didn't see him play in the slot last year. I only saw him outside, but I think his game fits the slot really well. He's a physical player. He had a play last year, I think it was against Tennessee, where they ran a little that wide now screen that they run, and a corner's blocking him, and he's a strong kid. He kind of holds the guy in with one hand and then reaches out and grabs the receiver with the other hand and just doesn't let go. And he's a tough kid against the run. He's a physical corner. He doesn't have great long speed. That's why I kind of like him in the nickel because he's a tough kid. I think he could present you some issues in the slot. And he's a guy, too, that could be someone that they bring on some some edge fires and things like that. He's the one DB that I look at and say, he could take some guys out with how he plays, and you've got to make sure you don't let him do that. You've got to either, run good routes against him and make plays against him, but then also do some things that maybe if he is playing a lot of nickel, which is kind of, I believe, new for him. I don't remember seeing him, and I broke down maybe 5 A&M games from last year. Didn't see him at nickel in any of those games. If he is playing a lot of nickel, you've got to do things to put him in stressful situations that he hasn't seen before. And that's where nickel's a lot different than playing outside. Outside, kind of everything's inside of you. And nickel, you got to have your head on a swivel because things are coming from outside and inside. Motions have a much bigger impact on a nickel than they do an outside corner. And so I would do some things to stress him. And if you don't, he's the kind of guy that can make some big plays and really hurt your offense. So those are my game wreckers for the matchup between the Notre Dame offense and the Texas A&M defense. Those are some players that I think Notre Dame is going to have step up in this game, and those are some guys that A&M they're going to have to prevent from A&M from taking over. And those are aspects of it that you look at. And we'll get into the offensive one next. But before we do, folks, hit that like, hit that subscribe, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review, and as always, sign up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. So let's get into the next part of this matchup, and that is the game wreckers on the Notre Dame defense against the game wreckers on the A&M offense. And this is going to be a big one as well, because to win a game like this, you need to do two things. One, somewhat negate the advantages that they have. And if they're great on the D line, you've got to not let them dominate you there. Even if you lose the battle, you've got to make it to where you win some. You may lose the war, but you win some of the battles, right? That's probably a better way of saying it. Because if you win some of the battles but lose the war, means they made more plays than you did. But with your skill talent, you also, on some of those wins, you made some big plays. The other side of the ball is where you say, okay, the other part of winning this is you've got to then dominate the areas where you have the matchup advantage. And that's going to be a big part of this game. And so this is where the game wreckers kind of come into conversation. And it really begins here with Riley Mills. We know who Howard Cross is. Duke knows who Howard Cross is. The offensive line coach for Texas A&M is the offensive line coach from who was at Duke last year. He remembers Howard Cross having 13 tackles, I think 3.5 tackles for loss, and a couple sacks in that game, a sack in that game. He remembers Howard Cross making the strip at the end of the game that knocked Riley out and Leonard out and basically ended any chance they had at competing for the ACC title last year. They're going to have a plan for Howard Cross. They're not going to let Howard Cross beat them again. That means Riley Mills has to step up and be a game wrecker. I've said it a million times. You guys have heard it. I know I'm a broken record on things like this, but it matters. As a quarterback, as an offensive coach, if my team got dominated up the middle, there wasn't a lot we could do. And if Notre Dame is going to really dominate this matchup the way that they need to, they've got to dominate up the middle. And I think Riley Mills is going to play a big role in that. When Riley Mills is on his game, he's unblockable. I mean, he really is. The problem is he's not always on his game. Is he going to be on his game this weekend against Texas A&M? We're going to find out. But he's a game wrecker to me that needs to step up. If Riley is the player he's capable of, it makes it very hard to stop Howard Cross. It also makes it very hard for you as a staff, as an offensive staff, to not only stop him, but then also have the linebackers not win on the blitzes and the pressures that they bring. Stopping the two tackles is key to success for Texas A&M, which means not being stopped and dominating are keys for Notre Dame. And I believe Riley Mills is the biggest key for that. If he goes off, A&M's going to have a very tough time moving the ball. Go watch the game against USC last year. The edges played well, everybody played well for Notre Dame. But Riley Mills and Howard Cross were just unstoppable, and especially Riley Mills. He was tremendous in that game, and because he's 6'5", he's a good athlete, and he's really long. And when he gets up in the pocket